Okay, good evening. So we've just gone the hour, so let's begin.
Hello, hi Glenn.
How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karvavahe Tejasvinavadidhamastu Mavit Vishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay, so we're here for Q&A. So we've had a question come through via email this week. So the question is, define autonomy in the context of self-development. Okay, so autonomy. So you can also look online, go to Google, go to the Oxford or Merriam-Webster dictionary and get some definitions. You'll see one here coming from APA, the American Psychological Association. So let's go through some aspects of what autonomy is. So autonomy is independence, self-determination, or agency. So when we use these phrases, we're talking about primarily our sense of how we feel in our activities. So if we have autonomy, it means that we are intrinsically motivated. We are motivated from within. The sense when we act is that we are fully willing in the action. We're completely engaged. There's no sense of resistance. There's a natural enjoyment and interest in it, and we feel and we recognize that there's value in the activity. So there's a full inner consensus towards the choices that we make, the activities we engage in. We're doing that independently. So self-determination. We also use that phrase when it comes to, say, nation states or subgroups within nations. There's the idea of self-determination. The opposite of that, of course, is to feel that we are being pressured, influenced, or incentivized from outside of ourselves. So one of the definitions that the American Psychological Association, their website, has for autonomy is that it means that we are acting from choice rather than feeling pressured. Autonomy is a sense of self-assertion and self-preservation. So it essentially means that we know who we are and we put ourselves into the world. We understand our nature. We understand our proclivities, our tendencies. We understand our needs, our existing demands, our level of development, and we naturally bring that to our environment. And of course, self-preservation means that we understand our boundaries and we do what we need to do to preserve the autonomy or preserve the independence of our being. Other aspect is self-sufficiency. So self-sufficiency means that we are able to take care of our needs by ourselves. Okay, so it's a brief introduction, I guess, to autonomy. So the question is, define autonomy in the context of self-development. So autonomy can be considered to be a core psychological need for human beings. And we, of course, have physical needs, food, water, sleep, etc. We have psychological needs as well. If any of our needs are unmet, it means that we become dysfunctional humans. So we can't function towards our own well-being. We can't discharge our obligations in life. We can't maintain proper relationships because certain needs are not being met. So autonomy is one of these psychological needs. When we have it, it's a predictor of our sense of well-being. When we lack it, the opposite. So when we talk about self-development and its relationship to autonomy, self-development implies enhanced autonomy. So it's important that when we talk about autonomy, we are not talking about an egoistic sense of superiority or, of course, inferiority. Autonomy is not the same as ego. So let's have a look at those same aspects that we just covered with regards to our development. So the first of those was independence, self-determination, agency, and acting from choice. So what would it mean? As we become more spiritually developed, we depend less on the sort of reward and punishment systems to get us to act. We become more intrinsically motivated. So what it means is that we are acting true to our own nature. I know what I am. I'm an engineer. That's my way of looking at the world. I'm an artist. I'm a singer. I'm a whatever I am. My own nature is clear to me. So another psychologist, Abraham Maslow, talks about self-actualization, not to be confused with the spiritual notion of self-realization. They're very different things. Self-actualization, he talks about as being the fulfillment of your nature. So as you become more self-developed, as you become more autonomous, you have an understanding of what your nature is. There's greater clarity and greater self-awareness. And you act to fulfill your nature, to reach your potential. So it means that you're not depending upon an external reward system to get you to act. Greater autonomy. You are aligned to your own higher values, conscience and conviction. So that's essentially saying the same thing. You know what you ought to do because you understand who and what you are. There's a great quote that was spoken by Christopher Hitchens a number of years ago in an interview asking about becoming a writer. So if you're not familiar, Christopher Hitchens is an author, cultural critic, thinker, etc. He was asked about becoming an author, and he said it's one of those things that you do if you can't not do it. I know that I have to write. The idea of not writing, spending my life not imparting my thoughts onto paper, it's untenable to me. So there is a sense of conscience and conviction that I'm doing what is right for my nature. When that happens, there's less of a dependency upon the opinions of others. People love it, people hate it, it's immaterial. I simply do it because I have to do it. So that reward punishment system holds less sway over us. We're more autonomous. And so you can see how that is clearly less ego. Because what would the opposite be? I'm only going to do it if I get something good out of it. Or I'm not going to do it because people might not like it. Or I'm only going to do it if people do like it. It's an easy way to see how that's an ego functioning. So as a consequence, we're less susceptible to external influence or threat. So things like peer pressure. What were some of these other aspects? Self-assertion, self-preservation, and self-sufficiency. So self-assertion and self-preservation, it means understanding and taking care of your own needs. Understanding what your boundaries are. Understanding what your course of action is in life. So to assert yourself is in and of itself, there's nothing egocentric or not egocentric about it. It's just an action. But self-assertion, putting yourself out into the world, putting your stamp on the environment, putting your perspective forward, putting your work out into the world, can come from an ego-centered perspective, and it can come from an objective, less ego-centered perspective also. With greater autonomy, that self-assertion and that self-preservation, that putting out into the world and that setting of boundaries is done again because of that greater clarity and greater self-awareness. So there's that beautiful quote that has been attributed to an English author by the name of Edward Carpenter. He says, "You must vouchsafe the personality and mind that much sympathy as you would to a stranger, no more, no less." So that's what this is talking about. To put yourself into the world, to take care of your needs, to act in self-preservation is done in the exact same way as you would for another person. You're not doing it out of a sense of ego. You're doing it because there's an understanding of what your vehicle requires. Your vehicle being your physical body, your mind, and your intellect. And that idea of self-sufficiency, as we grow in our self-sufficiency, we need less from others. We demand less of them. We're able to take care of our needs ourselves. You take a simple example. You go through a difficult time. An event happens in your workplace or in a relationship with your health. One thing is to say, I can't manage this unless I get soothed by the kind words and so forth of others. There's nothing wrong with reaching out to others, of course. But more than that, if we are less, put it this way, if we are more developed, we are able to relate to those experiences internally and, if you like, self-soothe. So we do need to process that experience so that we come to a state of mental balance, but we don't depend upon others to the same extent. We are self-contained. So autonomy and self-development go hand in hand. So there's another way that we can look at this, which is what we can call a polarity analysis. So this is drawn from the Vedas, the ancient scriptures. This little treatment that we're about to go through was developed by Bina Sharma. And so it starts with naming a personality trait or a characteristic. Now, normally we'd start with one that we feel really defines us as an individual. I'm really analytical, or I'm very big picture focused, or I'm really compassionate, or I'm really whatever. We have a word, just a phrase or an idea that we believe really defines us. Here we're not doing it that way. We're just looking at this particular trait of autonomy. So the first thing we do is to look at the trait of autonomy and say, what are the positives of it? So we're in the top left here. Now we've just been through all the positives. So these are the positive sides of autonomy. But like any value, like any trait, like any characteristic, it has a downside. Everything comprises opposites. So like all of our characteristics or our traits, we can take it too far. And once we take it too far, it starts to be counterproductive to our well-being, counterproductive to our growth. It starts to become more ego-centered. So we can ask the question, what are the downsides when autonomy is taken too far? What are some of the behaviors that we get into, the attitudes that we hold, the beliefs we hold? What emotions do we experience? How do we relate to our external environment? What's the effect on others? And what's the effect on ourselves when autonomy is taken too far, beyond the good and into the bad? So we can go back and have a look at some of these positive sides to start to think about that. Independence. What does it mean to be too independent? When we become too independent, it means that we don't have a connection to our environment. So independence becomes isolation, dissociation. We cut ourselves off. If we are too intrinsically motivated, then we can become what you might call solipsistic. What does that mean? It means that we feel like we're the only one who exists. I'm doing it because I like it. I can do whatever I like, and I'm going to do whatever I like because it suits me. So there's a selfishness. You can see how this becomes like a narcissism. It's all about me. So that sense of independence becomes isolation. That sense of being intrinsically motivated becomes doing whatever I like and not considering the consequences elsewhere. Self-assertion. Well, this is a fairly easy one. What happens when self-assertion goes too far? You go blundering into environments and you push your thoughts, your beliefs, your feelings onto others. Self-preservation. You take for yourself. So there's a sense of isolation, of selfishness, self-sufficiency. I don't need anybody else. That belief is fundamentally untrue. You can't feed yourself without the activity of thousands of other humans. Not to talk of the emotional and intellectual needs that we have. So self-sufficiency, again, it takes on this toxicity when we isolate ourselves from the environment. So that's just, again, a short, if you like, almost an example of how we treat this idea. First is autonomy, the good side of it. What happens when it goes too far? Isolation, gross egocentric assertion, etc. So then we ask ourselves the question, if we get ourselves into toxic autonomy, to use that phrase, what is the complementary opposite that we would need to move towards? And there's no right or wrong answer to this question. I mean, within reason. The way to adopt this analysis is to say, for you, once you've understood what autonomy is, what would seem to be a natural balancing tendency? And you could ask the same question to start with. Name a personality trait or characteristic. Now, instead of starting with autonomy, you could actually start with whatever we're going to consider to be the opposite. So what's a phrase? What's a word which characterizes or is a good label for the complementary opposite of autonomy? Okay, we could pick anyone. Relatedness, connectedness, empathy, compassion, community, communion. In fact, there's another author by the name of Ken Wilber who describes these two balancing poles, autonomy and communion, in self-determination theory. Autonomy is considered one of the key psychological needs, so is relatedness. So connectedness, relatedness, community, all of these sorts of ideas. Let's stay with the idea of communion, just to pick one. So now, what are the upsides of communion? And you go through the same analysis. Well, the upsides of communion, of course, is that you feel connected to something larger than yourself. You regulate your emotions by contact with others. So you develop mental peace. You're able to give to others, materially, physically, emotionally, intellectually, which again gives you an uplifted feeling. As you feel yourself part of a larger whole, your ego starts to diminish. The sense of separation falls away. Again, the list can go on. The idea of this analysis is to dig within yourself and come up with your own answers. And then we continue the analysis by going, now what's the downside? What's the downside of communion when it becomes toxic, when it goes too far? If I'm too connected to an environment or too connected to a community, what does that mean? I don't think for myself. Whatever the group thinks, I think it. I lose the awareness of my individual needs. Okay, I'm part of a group, and by and large, everybody in the group functions this way, which is fine for 95% of that group. But this particular personality, the one that I call mine, has different needs. If I'm too connected to the group, I follow along with the herd and I don't take care of my own needs. I become suppressed, frustrated. So these are some downsides of communion when it's taken too far. So what do I need to do? I need to swing my personality back towards autonomy. And so I get more into that pole of my own personality. I rebalance. Overall, the system becomes more healthy. And then, of course, I can get too much into autonomy, so I need to move back towards communion. And so there are these two opposites held in tension. We're not in one or the other. They are both present together in an appropriate balance. One person, their natural tendency is to be too much in autonomy. They tend to privilege that side of their personality for whatever reason. Another person is the opposite. They tend to privilege communion. They tend to go too far in that direction. So each person has a different ailment, so they each need a different antidote or a different treatment. But what's true for both is that they're bringing themselves back into a state of balance. How do we do that? The first thing is to understand these complementary opposites and how they function in the personality. The second is to ask yourself the question, when I'm too much in autonomy, what do I need to understand and what do I need to do to bring myself back to or towards communion? And vice versa, when I'm too much in communion, what do I need to understand? What do I need to do to bring myself back towards autonomy? So this is a self-reflection pathway that you need to adopt for yourself, because not everybody is going to be able to move in the same direction through the same method. And that's where you can take help. If you're finding it difficult to answer these questions, then speak to somebody who understands these concepts, understands this process, and have a dialogue. Try and figure out what do I need to do to bring myself back. So it's an entirely separate discussion. But the understanding here is that autonomy is always one side of a coin. And the other side is that communion or community or relatedness. So just touching on this final slide here, he says, according to some theories, an inordinate focus on self-determination and achievement represents a risk factor for the development of major depressive disorder and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So that's a pretty good description of one of the downsides of toxic autonomy, or moving too far in that direction. And you can see here, you start with autonomy, you go down, then up to the right, then down, then up to the left. You've got this infinity symbol. We keep on cycling through these quadrants, keeping ourselves balanced. Okay, any questions on autonomy?
No, it's perfect.
Okay. So there's another question that came through here, which is, I would want to understand what the purpose of attachment is and if there's a healthy way to have it in our life. How do we know we are experiencing unhealthy attachment? Okay, so the word attachment has different meanings or different connotations depending upon the context. In the context of psychology, for example, there can be healthy attachment and unhealthy attachment. In the context of Eastern philosophy, the word attachment is generally understood only as a negative, and the positive side of attachment is love, or what we were just talking about as communion, connectedness, relatedness. So, what is the purpose of attachment? So we can think of this idea in two ways. One is, what is the attachment itself trying to achieve? As something separate from you, the individual, in whom the attachment functions. So what's a good analogy for this? So in one of the texts by Swami Parthasarathy, he talks about the virus of attachment. This is the phrase that he uses. So that's a nice way to think about it, because when you have a virus, you could say, what's the purpose of the virus? So what do we mean by that? What is the virus trying to achieve? What's it trying to do? It's trying to replicate, it's trying to propagate itself, and so on and so forth. Think of the virus of attachment as being like that, something that is within your emotional body. So what is attachment trying to do? Let's think of it that way. To understand that, we can look at the definition of attachment. So one of the definitions of attachment, again given in the text, is love plus selfishness. What is love? We know the answer to this question. Every one of us has experienced this sense of connectedness, this desire for the well-being of something outside of ourselves, whether it's a houseplant or a pet, a partner, a spouse, a child, a parent, a sibling, a friend. We know what love is. It's hard to describe, but we've all had that experience of feeling connected to someone in a way where we want their happiness. Their well-being is important to us. It's a sense of oneness. Selfishness, we're also familiar with. Selfishness is that attitude of wanting to satisfy my demands without any real thought of the effect on others. So attachment is love plus selfishness. There is a person in my life and I feel connected to them. I feel like I'm at one with them. They have these beautiful qualities that I enjoy connecting with, but I want them for myself. So what is attachment trying to do? Attachment is trying to get certain demands met. And you can even go further than that. Attachment is trying to get certain fundamental needs met. What do we mean by that? So we talked earlier on about autonomy being a psychological need. We talked earlier on about relatedness, being part of something larger, as also a psychological need to give and receive affection. It's a need that the emotional body has, just as the physical body has needs. So when we have a need that is unmet, I don't really feel like people care for me. And I don't really feel like I have anyone to care for. There's a need which is unmet now. And so if that need is not properly addressed, it can become an ego-centered demand. I want, give me. And you meet someone, you become friends. And you don't want that person to be friends with anybody else. Only I want to be the recipient of your attention. What's happening here? I feel at one with this new friend or this new partner. But when you try and be friends with other people, what's happening? I feel like my demand to receive attention from you is being threatened. What's at the core of that? This need to be part of something, to be part of a group, to be accepted, to be cared for, and to care for others. So the attachment, if you like, what's its purpose? It's trying to get a demand met. It's trying to fulfill a desire, or you can even think of it as trying to fulfill a need. The problem is that it's doing it in a way which is not just unproductive, but counterproductive. When you tell another person in your life, don't associate with others, only give your attention to me, it has the exact opposite effect of what you want. That repels the person. And so they will move away from you. So what's the purpose of attachment? It's to try and gain a sense of mental stability. Because if I feel like I'm all alone, I'm unhappy, I'm mentally unstable, my emotions are not stable. So I have to attach myself to people and things in the world to feel stable now. So the other way to think about the purpose of attachment would be for it to be your purpose. What we just spoke about was taking the perspective of the attachment itself and say, well, what's the attachment's purpose? Now we can say, well, what's your purpose in having the attachment? Once you understand attachment in the way that we've described it, you can't legitimately say that you have a purpose for having that attachment. What you can say is, I recognize that at my current level of development, I am attached to my friend group. And the thought of my friends leaving me, rejecting me, is terrifying. So what do? Well, you can't just cut your attachment. You can't just cut the relationships. You'll collapse. And so what you might say is, I accept that for the moment I have this attachment, but I also recognize it's my obligation to become more autonomous, to become more self-sufficient, to filter out the selfishness and keep the love. So that's not a purpose in having the attachment anymore. It's rather an acceptance of its existence and a commitment to transcend it. How do you do that? You attach yourself to something higher. In the same way that when you climb a ladder, you can't let go of the current rung until you've got hold of the one above. Now you can let go of that and move up again. In a similar way, you can't just let go of your attachments to your friends, to your partners, to your family, to your money, to your health, etc. But what you can do is start to consciously reach for higher things. And this is the practice of knowledge and the practice of spirituality, is to deliberately choose goals or ideals that have a reduced ego component. as we reach towards those, we're actually beginning to become attached to those things. As a consequence, we can now let go of the attachment to the lower. A 6-year-old is very attached to his parents. As he becomes a teenager, he becomes attached to his friend group, something outside of the family unit. And now he can quite happily spend days, weeks apart from his parents. At 6 years old, the thought of spending 2 weeks away from his parents, scary. As a teenager, he can do it with ease because he's got somewhere else to go, somewhere more autonomous. So the purpose of attachment now we can think of as relinquishing the lower. So the purpose of a higher attachment, or what you might call a higher desire or an ideal, is to relinquish lower attachments. So that might be the only healthy way that we can think of attachment, is that when we are consciously choosing to become attached or desirous of something that is higher. And by that, we mean something that is less ego-centered, something that is directed more towards our genuine growth. How do we know we are experiencing unhealthy attachment? The negative effects of attachment are emotions that we find deeply unpleasant. Fear. The moment we experience fear, we can ask ourselves the question, what am I attached to? Okay, what's creating this fearful experience for me? Oh, I'm waiting for my blood test results. My annual blood test, I get them. And they still haven't come back. And why are you anxious? Why are you afraid? Well, what if they come back with some bad results? What am I attached to? Okay, I'm attached to my physical health. Tax time comes around. Fearful of having a large tax bill. Why? Attached to my money. Jealousy. We talked about that already. Go to my partner travels for 3 weeks to the other side of the country for her business, for her work. I'm jealous the whole time. Why? What if she's meeting with other men? I'm attached to my partner. I'm attached to the attention and the affection that I get from her. So jealousy is another one. Envy. Anger. Frustration. These emotions that we have that we find deeply unpleasant and that we try to distract ourselves from, that we try to get away from, we can often find their root cause in the attachment to something. So this becomes a really powerful way to self-reflect and to trace back to the underlying attachments. What am I experiencing? Okay, name that emotion. Don't just name it, feel it. Really get in touch with it, become intimate with it. What's the trigger? What's causing it? So it seems to me in the external world. Again, reflect, think about it, name it. What might I be attached to? So this sort of self-reflection highlights to us the things that we are attached to. Once we've identified that, then we can treat that attachment with knowledge. And again, this may be easy for you. If not, it's a good idea to bounce it off another person. But stay with one of the examples that we had. What am I attached to? I'm attached to my wife's attention and affection. That's why I'm feeling jealous and unstable. Who do I want to be? Once you've recognized that I have this attachment, who do I want to be? I want to be someone who is self-sufficient, not dependent, not clutching and clawing after someone else's attention. What kind of partner do I want to be? I want to be someone who is mature, who gives freedom, and who has freedom. So you might describe yourself in this way. Okay, now what does that look like as action? If I was in that state of maturity, of giving freedom to my partner, how would it look? What would I do differently? Well, I wouldn't be texting her at 9:30 at night just to make sure that she's in her room. I wouldn't be doing that. I texted her earlier today. There's no reason for me to have another discussion with her. I'm only texting her to see where she is. If I was more mature, I wouldn't. And then see if you can act from that place. See if you can express that action. I'm attached to my reputation as a good worker. And so when I take the credit for something, I don't actually mention that, yeah, this person and this person did a huge amount of the work as well. If I was trying to get out of my attachment, then what would the less attached person do? Well, they would share the credit. Can I act in that way? Can I act from that place? So it's important that we're not forcing ourselves to act like this. We're not suppressing the feelings that we've got. Instead, what we're doing is genuinely connecting with our desire to be better. We're genuinely connecting with that aha moment of, yeah, I see, I can sense what that maturity is like. That's who I want to be, and then act from it. So you're not forcing the action in a way that's inauthentic for you. The effort, the work you're putting in is to get to that place within yourself where you do have that moment of connection to the higher. So this is one of the ways that we're experiencing, that we can know we're experiencing unhealthy attachment, is the presence of some of these deeply unpleasant emotions. Unfortunately, part of the other effect of attachment is that we get a whole host of what we call really pleasant emotions. When you are attached to a new partner and they are equally attached to you, you're building this dependency over time, but it can feel wonderful. Staring into each other's eyes, not caring about the rest of the world, just me and you together. You're building attachment, but it feels good. That's more difficult. But again, if you have the presence of mind, it's simply asking the question, what's the quality and the nature of this thought? Am I building dependency? One of the other consequences of attachment is that we become manipulative and coercive towards others, and it can be done in a range of different ways. There is, of course, through the use of language and our physicality. So we talk to people in a certain way that's aggressive to get them to toe the line. Or we gaslight people. We make them question their own thoughts, their own intuitions, their own beliefs and convictions. We try and convince them that they're wrong about things that they're actually right about. Or we turn on the waterworks and pretend to be hurt and sad by something that they have done. Why? So that we can coerce them to act in a way that we like, or to stop acting in a way that I don't like. There's a whole host of ways that we try to manipulate and to coerce people to toe the line of our attachment. Again, when you're in it, it'll be hard to see. Someone from the outside will clearly see it. Ultimately, these sorts of behaviors will lead to relationship tension, conflict, and disharmony. So this is another this is another useful indicator to look for. Where is there tension, conflict, discord, or disharmony within a relationship? If that's the case, then it's very likely there's attachment on either one or both sides of it. And look at the way that you react to others. Whenever your attachment is threatened, you'll enter into fight or flight mode. If you're attached to your spiritual community and your ideology, then when someone questions, this doesn't seem to make sense, this seems all a bit like circular reasoning, and I know your community isn't really practicing what it preaches, it seems. How do you react? Now, how do you respond back into the environment? Because you may be on the outside, but it can be very difficult to see. You seem very, tolerant and unaffected by it, but inside you're reacting with a sense of resistance. So look for that sense of resistance to receiving information. If you tighten up internally, if you immediately reject things so that whatever comes to you just bounces off, the likelihood is you're attached to something and you don't want to receive new information, which may show you that attachment. So that's not an exhaustive list, but it starts to present the idea that where there is unhealthy attachment, the emotional states that we experience are counterproductive to our well-being. The relationships we experience have discord, and the way that people relate to us will also be negative.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Yeah, great question. It's a really important topic in the realm of self-development.
Yeah. And what happens if you feel that you are empath? Is that gonna make it more extreme?
So if you're an empath, or if you have a strong capacity for empathy, that's not in and of itself related to attachment. So when we talk about empathy, we can think about it as being either complete or incomplete, fully mature or not quite mature yet. So we have, broadly speaking, 3 dimensions to our personality. The physical body, which perceives and acts, the mind, which feels emotions, and the intellect, which has values, which has thoughts, which has comprehension. So complete empathy encompasses all 3 elements. So from the physical dimension, as you know, let's start with the emotional dimension. From the emotional dimension, you feel what the other person is experiencing. You resonate with it. There's a beautiful phrase, there's a beautiful concept in physics of resonant frequency. What that means is if you play, say, a guitar string of a particular note, if there's another guitar sitting next to it, that same string will start to vibrate. So that first string vibrates, it sends those waves out through the air, and those waves also influence the second string, and it also starts to vibrate. It's a really nice way to think about it. So some person is having an experience. They're vibrating, if you like, at a particular frequency. When we're empathic or empathetic, it means that we're able to pick it up. So we feel what the other person's going through. The emotional dimension is this. It's that sense, that feeling of knowing. It's intuitive, it's emotional. The cognitive or the intellectual dimension is to know what the other person's going through, to be able to describe it, to say that person is experiencing a feeling of abandonment because their partner has left them, they're feeling sadness because of something they've lost, they're feeling afraid because they might be alone now. You're feeling those feelings, but you're also able to describe them. You may not be perfectly articulate, it doesn't need to be so, but there's a sense in which the intellect is comprehending what the mind is feeling. So there's a comprehension there as well. Another really important, okay, I'm going to come back to the intellect again. The third element is the body. So the body is, of course, the organ which is receiving the information. When you're talking to somebody, you're hearing things through your ears, the tone of voice, the speed at which they speak, whether they're loud or quiet, angry or sad. You're seeing facial expressions and other body movements, receiving the stimuli through the body. The other aspect of the body is to act. And so the active component of empathy is that you want to act towards their well-being. And this is a really important component which is often overlooked. Sometimes we think of empathy as just knowing what someone else is going through. That's one of the dimensions of empathy. But if we don't have an interest in the other person's well-being, it's not complete. There's an example of this is described by the surname of the speaker was Cohen, and the title of his speech was 0 Degrees of Empathy. And he was referencing the Nazi war doctors during World War II. Now, those Nazi war doctors were torturing their victims. They would be able to know what the other person's going through because they're sitting there watching. They'd be able to feel to some degree the pain and the fear that they were going through. But there was zero interest in their well-being. It's not empathy. Clearly not empathy. True empathy, when it's complete, when it's mature, also recognizes that the person has their own well-being as their primary interest. You can't claim to say, well, I'm very empathic towards you. I feel your sadness and I know why you're sad, but I don't care about your sadness. You're missing the primary dimension of their experience, which is that they crave their own well-being. When you are truly empathic, you feel their desire for their well-being as well. It's what we were calling love earlier on. Well, one of the aspects of love is the desire for another person's well-being. So that's the active component, is that you want to act towards their well-being. Doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to. Sometimes you may not be able to. Sometimes you can, but you should not. There's a whole range of other factors that come into this. But leaving those aside, the other element of empathy is that you have an urge to act towards the other person's well-being. The fourth element of empathy is now back at the intellect. This is what keeps you objective. So what this means is that you're able to feel the other person's experience, to know it, to connect with them, but you don't take it on. You don't become burdened, drained by it. Now, to an extent, of course, you are expending your energy in this whole process. So it's not that it's an energetically neutral process, but you're spending your energy in anything that you do. But what's important is that you're not becoming burdened, you're not suffering because of the connection, because you're objective. Now, one of the analogies we always talk about when we're trying to describe this, you're watching a movie. Okay, now you're watching the movie Titanic, and you're looking at Rose and Jack floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on a piece of wood, or one of them is anyway. You feel the sense of fear, isolation, impending death, all of that you're feeling. You know why they're feeling it. Your heart breaks for them, but you're not burdened by it. You're not suffering. It's not draining you. At the end of the movie, you don't feel like I need to somehow rebalance or recharge because that movie was too much for me. Why not? Because you know it's a movie, you're objective. So the other aspect of empathy, again, when it's fully mature is that we have an attunement to higher values such that we are fully connected to the person, we feel what they're feeling, we know it, and we want to serve them, but there's a degree of transcendence of that, there's a degree of separation of that, where we don't take it on as a burden for ourselves. And that comes through a correct understanding of life, a correct understanding of what your obligation is and what it's not. Are you responsible for another person's suffering? Are you responsible for another person's experience? Are you responsible for the choices they have made up to the point that they're sitting in front of you now? What are your responsibilities? Who's responsible for their mental state? Who is responsible for the way that they are experiencing their life? Okay, ultimately, each one of us has our own responsibility for our experiences. Now, we also have an obligation to help others. But that's different from saying, I have to take on the burden of your suffering. So having a clear understanding that each one is responsible for their own lives. This is just an idea that can help to keep us emotionally protected, energetically protected. So a good example of this, of course, is in the healing professions. Psychologists and psychotherapists, doctors and nurses. As a professional, they're able to close the book on that particular client or patient and move to the next. Close the book on that particular client and then move to the next. And at the end of the day, they go home. Ideally, they close the book, they close the door to their practice, and they go home, unburdened by everything that's happened. There is that professional distance. Now, that's the ideal, of course. In fact, what we do find is the idea of emotional burnout in some of the healing professions exactly because of this. And so there is that need to build our empathy engine in this complete way, as well as find ways to rebalance our emotions, re-energize, rebalance our mental state, find rest, and so forth. So those need to go hand in hand with the building of our empathy. So if you are an empath, you do run the risk of these negative effects, but we also have the ability to, over time, develop our empathy so that they diminish.
Thank you so much.
Any other queries or questions?
No.
All right. Well, we are back tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time for the final installment of Ishavasya Upanishad. So for those joining, I'll see you then. If not, have a great week, and I'll catch you next time.
Great. Thank you.